Hello there, I'm Gary Sims and this is Gary Explains. Now you may have seen portrait photos where the subject, the person in the photo is very clear and crisp in the foreground, but what's in the background is very blurred. Now this blurriness is often called a shallow depth of field or bokeh, and the question is, how do you get that effect so you can get really kind of standout portrait photos? How do you get that effect on your digital camera? Well, let me explain. So let's start off first by talking about the idea of the depth of field, and particularly a shallow depth of field. Now when you focus in on something, whether it's a person or an animal or an object, they are at the focal point and they are crisp and sharp in the picture. Now behind that person or object or in front of it, there are different areas where the focus remains sharp, and then as you increase that distance, they become out of focus. You may have experienced it if you take a photograph of somebody and you kind of focus the camera and then they move and you don't refocus, they will now be out of focus. Now this distance between where they are focused and where things start to go in and out of focus is called the depth of field. Now you can actually set up your camera in such a way that a person can move several feet, back and forth, and they will still remain in focus. This means they have a wide depth of field. But there are other situations which I'm going to talk about where when you focus the camera, even a slight movement of maybe a foot, half a meter, and actually the person will go out of focus. And this is a shallow depth of field. Now to get the effect where the background is blurred, the background is out of focus, you obviously want a shallower depth of field. The wider the depth of field, then more things in the background will be caught that are in focus. So for those really sharp, really nice portraits with a blurred background, that bokeh effect background, you want a shallow depth of field. So how do you achieve a shallow depth of field on your camera? Well, there are three important ways. So let's look at them. Now the most important technique is to use a large aperture when you take your photo. If you remember, the aperture can be varied from a big hole to a small hole on your camera, and that's measured using f-stops. So if someone says I'm setting on f3, then that means it's a fairly large number. If they go down to f8 to f11, f16, it means that the aperture is getting smaller. So remember, it's the other way around. A small number means a large aperture, a large number means a small aperture. And you want to use kind of f2.8 or lower to get that really good depth of field effect. Now the way you do that is you just set your camera on aperture priority mode. And on a Canon camera, that means you set it to the AV mode. On other cameras, you set it to the A mode. Now once you're in aperture priority, what happens is you manually select which aperture you want to use, and then the camera calculates the shutter speed and the ISO it wants to use to be appropriate for that aperture number. And you want to move it right down to the lowest number that your lens currently supports. And then once you get down to that number, then you can then just take your photo in the normal way, and then the background will be blurred as possible for your current setup. So okay, if we look at this picture here of the cup on the table, you can see that in the background the mountains are fairly clear, the clouds are clear, the house on the left with the red roof is quite clear, and this was taken at f22. And so by f22 it means that it's a smaller hole and there is a greater, wider depth of field. And because the hole is smaller, you can see the picture was taken at 1/125th of a second because the frame had to be exposed for longer to get the light in. Now if we move to the next picture, we can see that everything is the same, ISO is the same, 12mm zoom, but here it's taken at f7.1, so a slightly larger hole. Because it was larger, the shutter speed was quite quicker. But you can see here that the house on the left with the red roof is starting to be out of focus. The house on the right is out of focus, but the cup is still clearly in focus. And the mountains and the clouds are starting to be slightly blurred. And if we now move to the f3.5 shot, which was taken at 1/4000th of a second, again because the aperture is now big and lots of light are coming in. The cup of course is still very clear, but look, the background there, the mountains and the clouds are really quite blurred now, and the houses to the left and the right are significantly blurred, even to the point on the right you can't really pick out any detail on them. Now the second way to do this is to increase the distance between your subject and the background, because obviously if there is a depth of field, a point where things start to go out of focus, you want to make sure the background is beyond that last point of the depth of field. Now the way you do that is you get close to your subject. So getting close to your subject will really help with the depth of field. Okay, so on this picture here of the bud on the tree there, you can see that the bud is in the middle of the frame, and in the background we do have some blurring already, but I want you to particularly notice the house there in the background. You can just see the shape of the roof, and you can see the outline of the windows. You can see some of the fencing there. It's out of focus. You've got good shallow depth of field there, but actually there are some details you can pick out. Now in the next shot, all I did was move closer. I didn't change the aperture, I didn't change the zoom. All I did was move closer to the bud, and look at this now. You can see the bud is still in the center of the frame, but even the twig behind it is actually now out of focus. And when you look at the house there in the background, you can't see any detail at all. The fence is hard to see. That extra outhouse building, you can't even make that out there. And all I did there was move closer with my feet, and you can see that I had a dramatic difference, because now the camera is focusing on something that's very close to the lens, and as a result the depth of field is quite shallow, and therefore you get this blurring in the background. And the third way is actually to use your zoom. When you zoom in, one of the effects of zooming in is actually to reduce the depth of field. And so therefore zooming into something, zooming into an object, can also create that depth of field effect. So actually if you want to knock it down to kind of f2.8, f1.4, and then also zoom in a bit, you really are going to get some good depth of field effects, some good bokeh effects. But again, the key here is to use aperture priority mode so that you can override and set the aperture to be as large as possible, which means to have the smallest number possible. And on this picture here, you can see I'm using a wide shot. I'm at 12mm, f5.6, and you can see that the tree is in focus, the fence is in focus, you can see some of the grass here. The house in the background, if you actually zoomed in, is fairly well defined, and you can see that quite well. But now what I do is I keep my feet in the same place, but I've zoomed in to the maximum zoom that I had on this lens, and you can see quite a difference now. The house in the background there has started to become out of focus, the trees are out of focus, and the fence is out of focus. So I zoomed in, I didn't move, I zoomed in, and that also produced, not quite so remarkably, but it did produce a shallow depth of field effect. So if you use those three techniques, you should be able to get some good bokeh effects. So my name's Gary Sims, and this is Gary Explains. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I'd love to hear about your experiences trying to use a shallow depth of field on your camera. That would be really good to chat about that in the comments below. Also, you know what else I'm going to ask you? Please subscribe. Please hit that bell notification icon so you become part of our notification squad. Do share this video on social media, and also please do give it a thumbs up. Okay, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.